we've spent 4 years slagging off Dominic Cummings, and how he's gone and ruined it by turning on the government. A few hours before we recorded the podcast, Cummings celebrated the first anniversary, plus 1 day, of his Rose Garden press conference, the one with the eye test, by facing questions from the Health Select Committee and the 5-hour... Was it how many hours?
No, it was more than that.
It was more like 6.5
hours.
Yeah, 7 hours.
Epic.
It's like fucking Lord of the Rings.
Megamind versus the mayor from Jaws did not disappoint. Ian, because we're in the studio, I'm able to point at you like Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man. How credible did you find Cummings' testimony overall? Did he sort of confirm or contradict what we already knew from reporting, such as failures of state?
Yeah, exactly. Failures of state was what kept on ringing through my mind. And that interview that you had with them, right? Because do you remember there was a certain point where they went, anything up to March 14th, you can kind of justify. And after March 14th, you can't. And the thing is, his timetable operated pretty much to exactly the same point. He had a meeting that happened on the 13th where he says the Deputy Cabinet Secretary walked into a room in Downing Street and just said, we're fucked. We're going to kill thousands of people. But basically, that's the period. This sort of period from sort of the 11th to the 14th. So overall, you look at the story that he was telling, and it does correspond to the investigative journalism that we've seen, to the reports put out by public health bodies, to the statements from public health experts. It corresponds to what we know about the care homes, what we know about the impact of those 2-week or longer delays on lockdowns. It corresponds. I think that the bit where it gets more difficult is the minutiae, right? Because the minutiae is suddenly where that kind of Cummings galaxy spaff brain comes into fucking view, right? Like all of a sudden, what's incredible is everyone is a hero or a villain. Like no one is grey in his world, apart from him. He is super nuanced. Like he fails in some things, he succeeds in others, he learns, he changes. Everyone else is either like the worst cunt you have ever fucking met, or they are, he literally called several people, the most ethical person I have ever known, blah, blah, blah. The person who he hates the most is Matt Hancock. There was a point, honestly, when they brought up Barnard Castle, Steve Pearce, the wonderful Steve Pearce online, went, he's going to say that Matt Hancock did that. And obviously that was true, because fucking Hancock just got blamed for all things. All failures is Matt Hancock's fault. Whereas others, you might notice, like Rishi Sunak, was defended over and over again. And that's the sort of stuff that makes you think, oh, what the fuck's going on here? You've clearly got an agenda that you're working to.
Many viewers thought that Cummings was positioning himself as the guy who was right but wasn't listened to, like the scientist at the beginning of a Roland Emmerich movie. But what surprised me was he did actually apologise for his failings. He said, I apologise for not having acted earlier. If I had acted earlier, lots of people may still be alive. And he includes himself in the people who fell disastrously short, failed people. Now, that's something that it doesn't happen often, where people not only say, I made a mistake, but it's like, I made a mistake that killed people. Am I giving him too much credit for that admission?
It was fucking weird, wasn't it? Because he was quite contrite. It was a really different, to compare him to what he was a year ago when he sat in the garden, treating every criticism as a conspiracy and inventing these extraordinary stories in order to justify himself. It's a very different guy that you saw. And I presume that's just because he's smart enough to know how that come across. It comes across much better. And by the way, it's a pretty believable story that he told, for what it's worth. When people were like, well, why didn't you challenge harder in March, in late February? He was like, well, it's actually pretty fucking difficult when there's just like a lot of scientists on stage saying this will not work this way. When basically the whole sort of medical establishment, certainly the people in their bubble were all against it. And I kind of got that. I was just thinking like, well, I would probably think, well, surely they understand this better than I do. I didn't blame, to be honest, I did find all of that quite believable. But I don't think that necessarily means it's because he suddenly turned over a new leaf. I think it's just because that's how he thought he would be most convincing. Because ultimately, again, when you drill down to some of the individual things he was saying, they did feel quite self-serving. They did feel as if they were, is it credible, for instance, that he says Sunak at no point tried to stop the second lockdown. Now, we have it really well documented, again, by the failures of state guys, over and over, that he did do that. It's been documented by several different journalists, really credible sources, frankly, more credible than Dominic Cummings. So on that basis, you're like, so what's your game? Is it literally just as simple as like, you just want to like fuck Hancock and then think that you can get in with Sunak later on? It's like, because it feels that obvious, but can it really be?
Because he ignores Hancock's, because there is a mixed, they have mixed records. He ignores Hancock's successes and also he ignores Sunak's failures. It's that binary you're talking about. It's like,
whichever way you look at it, Hancock is not solely responsible for everything that happened. He is inept like, you cannot describe. He's like a human cardboard in a storm, okay? But that still puts him head and shoulders above most of the people in fucking cabinet. He's still got lots of the calls right on lockdown. He hasn't, he would not even be in my top 10 people in the cabinet that I wanted to remove from there. I mean, I want to remove the whole fucking cabinet, but he's not, you wouldn't single him out. So it felt kind of just bizarre after a while, especially when you think about just how gushing he was about several other figures that we really do have it on very good evidence did not have that effect over time.
Alex, I wanted to ask you about Hancock. Cummings says he should have been sacked on 15 to 20 occasions, which is kind of like a hardcore version of fire and rehire. There was a feeling, I suppose, that Hancock's performance improved over time, but there's strong evidence here that he did lie on several occasions in the early phase. We've seen this in reporting as well. Saying everybody got the care they needed. We know that wasn't true. And there were other kind of lies that Cummings mentioned. Were you sort of convinced by that, or were you surprised by the sort of ferocity of the attack?
I was less surprised than Ian, I think, because the reason Cummings singled out Hancock seemed to me quite credible. So what I picked up was that Hancock was the one person in government who was basically instead of working towards the medium and long-term goals that they had as a group to do with this pandemic. What Cummings described was a person who was working on the day-to-day goals of what he can claim as a success at his next press conference. And that can be quite destructive when you're trying to work as a team towards slightly more long-term goals. So, for instance, the example about the 100,000 tests, which we all knew at the time was bullshit. We all knew at the time the tests had been bottlenecked in order to sort of reach a superficial high. We all knew that they were counting tests that were sent out but were not sent back. We knew that they were counting multiple tests for the same person, where those tests had been unsuccessful. And so we knew that figure was bogus. But what Cummings said made perfect sense to me, that in order for Hancock to be able to stand up at that press conference and say, I got to my target, he was disrupting the work that was going on behind the scenes to try and build a slightly more sustainable track and trace system by going, no, you down tools on the main objective and do this thing that I want you to do now because I need another 10,000 tests from you. And I think that's why it felt to me he was particularly singled out for criticism, because I think out of all those people, with the exception of Johnson, who is, his own animal and was at the top of the table in any case, I think Hancock was the person in the team that was not working as a team player.
Ros, Cummings paints this damning picture of Boris Johnson. I mean, could hardly be more damning. If he thinks that Johnson is a walking indictment of the political system and one half of the appalling choice presented to the electorate in December 2019, how did he blunder into becoming his top advisor?
Yeah, that is.
It's very unfortunate.
That is
if there's a guy that you think doesn't deserve to be prime minister, and then you're an advisor, and you can't get out of it, and you keep trying to make excuse, but then you get like.
I think, to be honest, he felt a sense of responsibility because fundamentally it is because of Dominic Cummings that Boris Johnson is in Downing Street. If it hadn't been for the success of Vote Leave, if it hadn't been for Johnson joining the campaign, then we wouldn't have had Theresa May, and we wouldn't have had Theresa May being ousted because Cummings and his ilk pushed for the hardest form of Brexit. So there is a direct link there. Therefore, Cummings knows in his heart of hearts that he is responsible for Boris Johnson being in Downing Street. So what is a responsible thing to do when you've created this fuck up? Well, I mean, you can see it as, well, the guy's invited me to join him. I'm a lot cleverer than he is. Maybe I can actually make his premiership slightly less of a car crash than it would otherwise be. And I think that Cummings' ego is sufficiently large that he did think that way. And he thought, he wants me there. he relies on me. I can stop the worst excesses, the worst flaws of Johnson's character, and I can, fulfill what I want to do. And all these these dreams about the overhauling the civil service and bringing in big new scientific agencies, I can do that at the same time. So I think that's the rationale.
He said, incidentally, so explicitly, you may have missed this because I think you may have been travelling towards the studio.
I didn't get to sides. I didn't get to disc 6 of the box set.
It was right at the end of his session. But what he said, and I'm quoting him fairly verbatim here, is that the heart of the problem of why he didn't leave earlier was that I came to the view that Boris Johnson was not fit to do the job. And I was trying to build a structure around him that would prevent him from making bad decisions and basically railroad him into what I saw as the right decisions. Now, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's democratic or not, that is explicitly what
that's
he
the Trump.
said he was trying to do.
That's the ex-Trumper defense, isn't it? We saw it again and again from people like John Bolton.
For sure. And it's a very charitable interpretation of things that he makes on himself. I think the real truth is that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are both blaggers of very different style, but both blaggers. They both have built a career by believing very firmly that they are the smartest person in the room and they can run rings around everyone else. And when they share a room, it is an inevitability that the time will come when they actually realize that they're both trying to play each other.
Because another thing that really threw me about Johnson was when Cummings says that actually it was good that he didn't attend the Cobra meetings because he would have made them worse.
Oh, yeah, they were trying
number
to
10
keep him.
officials were saying that.
Yeah,
he wasn't alone. He was apparently, they seemed relieved that he was there.
That he was, whatever he was doing, which is why they're worrying about Carrie's dog, or trying to write his no doubt groundbreaking scholarship on the barge, in which we will learn entirely new things.
Make it up.
About
you just could not fucking make it up.
But I like the idea that they're just like, yeah, mate, just go off, go off and write about A Midsummer Night's Dream or something. We've got this.
Julius Caesar, surely.
Oh, Henry V. He wanks on about Henry V, doesn't he?
I find all of this a bit too generous. I mean, basically, it must be. The reason he's not there now in Downing Street is because they had a fucking briefing war. Because he really hates Boris Johnson's girlfriend, and she really hates him. Like, you drill down to this shit. Like, there's no great, points of principle or fundamental. It was just like he's a vitriolic, spiteful, unpleasant, super arrogant, egomaniacal twat. And therefore we had this big fight and he fucking leaves. Then when he leaves, he tells this story. And the thing is, the story I don't think is definitely not entirely false. I don't even think it's mostly false. Like most of the reports you heard from inside, I kind of believe his timetable. About mid-March, he decided, you know what, that's not going to fucking work, which is not shocking. That's when lots of people were coming to the realization you needed to lock down. And then he pushed for it. That's what you heard from behind the scenes, that he would push for it. You also did hear, by the way, that Matt Hancock did the same thing. And you certainly heard that Michael Gove used to do the same thing. They were the names that used to get mentioned to you. As these guys kind of get it a bit more than the others. And so he puts this story together. And in doing so, he really just wants to fuck the guys that paid him insufficient respect before. And that's really the ultimate motivating factor. You can still get truth out of it. You can extract it from the guts of this terrible machine. But I think ultimately I don't want to be too generous to him because I just think he's kind of appealing to it right now. I honestly think today he was going out of his fucking way not to offend Remainers. The madness of the words that are coming out of my mouth. If you think about all the times we've sat over the last 4 years and just gone, he used to fucking love slagging us. Every time someone doorstepped him, he'd be like, get the fuck out of North London. You don't understand the real people, from his house in fucking North London. Like, and now he's like, but not to talk about the rights or wrongs of Brexit, and not to, and he said that several times. Then he said, culture war, nothing to do with me, mate. He literally said nothing to do with me. You're just like, what the fuck are you talking about, Dom?
You did the blogs. I've seen the blogs.
We know when it was you sending stuff to journalists, because it was always written like you thought you were in some Andreou performance of Sparta. Like you're a fucking idiot. So for that, I just think, he is trying to appeal to people like us right now, and I think we should take the stuff that we can use, but let's not get seduced into this idea that ultimately he was always a pretty good guy behind the stage. I don't think he is.
So do we have to drop him from the podcast next week because he was going to be our special guest. It was going to be 8 hours long.
It's not about that. It's about matching the account with what we have as external evidence.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of external evidence. I wrote a piece like 10 months ago that came to the exact same timeline and the exact same conclusions about the panic that was going on during that march in Downing Street, simply from reading the SAGE meetings and watching all the press conferences, because you could see, in the Parthenon marbles at the British Museum, there's this amazing thing that even though most of their heads are missing, you can see in the tension of their body that the ones towards the center know that Athena is being born, while the ones towards the edges are still all relaxed because they don't know the news of the new divine birth.
This is a very Greek analogy.
But it was precisely. But when you watch all the daily news conferences, one after the other, you can absolutely see when Whitty and Valence's body language changes from quite relaxed, quite jokey to quite ashen and quite serious. And you can see that the guy in the middle, Boris Johnson, hasn't got the fucking news yet. And you can see that as they progress, their body language gets even more glum until one day he gets it in the middle. This is perfectly plain for anyone to see. So you don't have to take Dominic Cummings' word for it. But, when he turns around and says that, Boris Johnson laughed and said to him, there's nothing wrong with chaos. I like chaos because if there's chaos, everyone turns to me because I'm the guy in charge. That to me has the ring of truth. And that is more revealing and more damning than any other bitty evidence about the sort of Borgias wars that were going on behind the scenes.
That's ultimately what brought Cummings and Johnson together, a love of chaos. Cummings saw Brexit as a disruptive thing that would shake everything up and we could all make it new and creative destruction. And Johnson sees chaos in the same way, as an opportunity. And that is what held them together for so long.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ros, obviously the quote that I'd imagine would be on front pages tomorrow was the Deputy Cabinet Secretary apparently saying early on, I think we're absolutely fucked. This country is heading for disaster. We're going to kill thousands of people. Now, obviously, it's sort of good that this has come out now, but did it leave you thinking that there was an upside to the fact that the public didn't know how chaotic things were behind the scenes? Because there's certain things that were revealed that in that very delicate period where people needed some degree of trust in the government in order to not just we could be punching each other in the aisles of Sainsbury's. And were you actually thinking, my God, if all of this had just come out in that really intense march, that actually the consequences could have been quite grim?
Yes and no. Yes, in that obviously we had panic buying anyway, and people were scared, and parents were taking their kids out of my primary school even before the schools closed. Clearly there was public alarm. But on the other hand, I don't think until it came to the crunch, Johnson ever succeeded in conveying the magnitude of what the worst case scenario, the scenario that was going to happen, was. And that made it very difficult because, we were in a position where, as Cummings set out today, herd immunity was the policy until about 15th of March. And no one is any doubt about that. It's clear now that was what it was, because they thought if we stamp on it now, it will just come back in the winter, which will be worse. And we haven't got a vaccine yet, and we won't have a vaccine for a long time. And so that was the policy. Then it wasn't the policy, but that was never made explicit. It was never made explicit to the population that decision, that there was a change of mind. They just rode back on it in a pathetic way. And so you had people very confused thinking, we should catch it. Oh, now we've got to lock down. And that was the way that I think it played with people's minds in a very damaging way. And the government was not honest with us. And all the time, Johnson was saying, oh, we don't need to worry. And then suddenly there was this serious, terrifying Johnson. And I think that there wasn't the kind of gradual ramping up, which there should have been, of people having to realise how serious this was. And that has had long-term consequences as well, because it has emboldened people who said that we never needed a lockdown in the first place. And that turned out, I mean, I don't deny that I found it extremely difficult to get my head around the idea of a lockdown. I was wrong about that. I just couldn't conceive how the state could support people through a lockdown, how that was even possible. I couldn't imagine something like furlough. That was beyond my imagination. No, it was beyond my imagination. It really wasn't. It was beyond Sage's imagination at first, because we know from the plans that they had that they totally ruled out any travel bans or lockdowns. Even school closures were maybe. It just was not on the radar. And I took a long time to get my head around it. And it is not surprising to me that people in government did as well, but we should have had it. There should have been a gradual levelling with the public rather than this sudden U-turn.
But it seems like quite a sudden U-turn even for the people in the room. And one error that you sort of mentioned there was made by scientists as well as politicians, was this assumption, this behavioural psychology assumption, that the public just wouldn't stand for a lockdown, And that ran in tandem with the assumption that there was actually no point trying to suppress it because there'd only be a spike later, so you might as well just kind of, have chickenpox parties or, however they thought that was going to work. So what emerged for me was obviously that Johnson should carry the can and Matt Hancock should be fired over and over again. But
from a cannon,
much better, these much bigger systemic failures, to do with sort of establishment thinking, to do with groupthink. I do think Cummings was right on that.
Yeah.
So do you think that people, because obviously the message that people take away, particularly people that don't like this government, is the kind of personality stuff and the kind of like the bitchy drama. That this seems to me to suggest that hopefully going on behind the scenes now in Whitehall, in the NHS, in Sage, is some serious kind of rethinking in preparation for the next time.
Yeah, I think there is, and not just for pandemics, but for other threats as well, as Cummings hinted at today when he talked about all kinds of, anthrax, biological attacks and so on. And I think there has been a realisation, and I heard Kate Bingham, the head of the Vaccine Task Force, say this last night, that you need more scientists in government. You need a wider selection of people. You don't just want to have arts graduates writing policy papers about stuff they don't understand, which is often the case. You really need more people from a wider variety of backgrounds in government to stop this kind of groupthink. And that is true. And he is right about that. I don't like the approach he took, clearly the way he drove out very good civil servants when he was in Downing Street was reprehensible. But he has, like any evil genius, he has moments of clarity that we shouldn't necessarily ignore.
Well, finally, Ian, cynical Twitter brain will assess the impact of Cummings' testimony in terms of polls and headlines. But even if it doesn't turn the nation against a fatally incompetent government, do you think that this has a deeper value to the historical record, or to the people whose job it is to develop best practice, that this will matter even if, the Tories gain a point in the next poll?
Yeah, I couldn't give if I hear another person on Twitter just pop up this despairing bullshit you get all the time, just like, won't make any difference, we're all still going to die, the polls are fucking, now they're going to be 20 points. Just like, fine, I get it. I get the thing with the polls, that is a fucking thing, and that does not please me, but you can just put that in its box for now. Because this shit matters in its own terms. It doesn't just matter insofar as, that has a political impact. When he talks about those deaths, when he talks about the fucking care home deaths, that's 36,000 people that died that way. And when he talks about the delays over the winter lockdown, that's over 20,000 people that died. And there is a fucking moral imperative and an intellectual imperative to try and understand it. And it doesn't mean that you take him at face value. It means that you do take it as the statements of someone that was inside the machine that you put together with the rest of the evidence to try and work out what went wrong. And that is not just about punishing the people that fucked up, although, by the way, it should be about punishing the people that fucked up, but it is also about the process of recognizing how you do not do it again. So, it's just I just think for this, you just put the party politics to one side. Fuck all of that. This is about just on the basic level paying some respect to the tens of thousands of people who lost their lives because of these people's goddamn fucking inadequacy.
And that's why I think the stuff that was said about the second lockdown is what needs to take up much more space in column inches and history books in years to come. Because actually, to make horrific mistakes in March because your eye's not on the ball, because all of this stuff that we've heard over and over again like a chewing gum, it was unprecedented. We were doing the best we can. There were difficult decisions. We were following the science. To make all those mistakes in the first 2 weeks in March may be forgivable. To make the exact same mistakes in the second 2 weeks of September, when it wasn't a fucking difficult decision, it was a really easy decision at the end of September. The science was telling you the same thing as everything else was telling you, and you had the experience of the first wave. To make the same fucking mistakes in those last 2 weeks in September is utterly, utterly unforgivable.